Welcome to Pediheart, Pediatric Cardiology Today. My name is Dr. Robert Pass, and I'm the host of this podcast. I'm professor of pediatrics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where I'm also the chief of pediatric cardiology. Thank you for joining me for this 309th special episode of Pediheart. I hope all enjoyed last week's episode in which we spoke with Dr. David Hoganson of Boston Children's Hospital about computational fluid dynamic modeling for patients who are undergoing single ventricle palliation. Dr. Hoganson explained to us the myriad manner in which he and his team are able to perform virtual surgeries to determine the optimal way to perform a Fontan and the multiple possible uses of this technology going into the future. For those of you interested in the Fontan, single ventricles, and surgical modeling, as well as surgery in general, I'd recommend you take a listen to last week's 308th episode. As I say most weeks, if you'd like to get in touch with me, my email is easy to remember. It's pediheart@gmail.com. This week we'll be spending the entire podcast speaking with the noted congenital heart surgeon, Dr. John W. Brown, who is a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon and who helped found Indiana's first pediatric heart transplant program. Dr. Larry Markham of Riley Hospital for Children in Indiana reminded me recently that Riley Hospital was celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, providing amazing care to children in Indianapolis, Indiana. During that time period, the pediatric heart program has grown in volume and reputation, and interestingly, it has had only 4 surgical chiefs in its entire history. And these are namely Dr. Harris Schumacker, who was a disciple of Dr. Alfred Blaylock, and started working there in the 1950s, followed by Dr. Harold King, and then Dr. Brown, and recently Dr. Mark Turrentine. Dr. Brown worked at Indiana University Hospital and Riley Hospital for Children for most of his attending surgical career, spanning an incredible 46 years. He performed the first pediatric heart transplant in the state in 1988, and also 1 decade later implemented the nation's first bovine venous valve implant in a 13-month-old child. And he did this based upon his longtime research in this arena, introducing this valve into congenital heart surgery. And we all know how important that concept has become for us in both surgery and, more recently, transcatheter valve procedures. Dr. Brown was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery in Indiana for over 20 years, and it's estimated that he has completed over 15,000 pediatric heart operations at Riley Hospital and another 5,000 in adults at Indiana University and Methodist Hospitals. In 2013, Dr. Brown was honored by the Indiana University School of Medicine with the formation of the John W. Brown, M.D., Endowed Chair of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Dr. Brown has a long list of other honors and awards, including the John B. Hickam Award in 1970, Cor Vitae Heart of Life Award in 2008, Distinguished Faculty Award in 2010, Sagamore of the Wabash in 2018, and he was recently awarded the Indiana University Bicentennial Medal in recognition of his distinguished contributions to Indiana University in 2019. There are so many contributions of Dr. Brown, but clearly his work in expanding pediatric open-heart surgeries in newborns and infants at Riley is one of his most long-lasting professional legacies. He retired from full-time practice in 2021, and he is the first Harris B. Schumacker Professor Emeritus of Surgery, and I am told that he continues to this day to help his surgical colleagues intermittently in the operating room. In addition to all of these wonderful professional achievements, Dr. Brown has been married to his high school sweetheart, Carol Ann Brighton Brown, for 55 years, and they have 3 married children and 7 grandchildren. We'll speak today with Dr. Brown about his life and times, about balancing his family life with his professional one, and what he believes are the most enduring and important contributions he's made. And so without much further ado, let's welcome Dr. Brown to Pediheart. Okay, I'm here now with Dr. John Brown. John, thank you so much for joining us this week on the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a great honor to have you, I have to say, and I've been very excited. A lot of buzz on the internet about you joining us this week, and I want to start by thanking Dr. Larry Markham of Riley Children's for being so thoughtful to offer this suggestion of talking with you, and I'm really honored that you would spend some time with us, so thank you very, very much. You know, I thought just to start, we've had a number of different famous cardiac surgeons and cardiologists on the podcast, and I usually start by asking, something simple like, where did you grow up, and How did you decide to become a doctor and then a surgeon? Were there other doctors in your family or any other mentors in medicine early in your life that you looked up to and maybe gave you an idea?
Well, I'll start at the beginning. I grew up on a 40-acre farm in south central Indiana, a very nuclear family. My parents and grandparents were farmers. My dad sharecropped another 300 acres, and my brothers and I helped our dad farm as we were growing up.
Wow.
And so my two older brothers and my younger sister were the first in our family to attend college. Our parents thought education was important for us to do, and they thought farm life was great. However, they thought that we had maybe the potential of doing something more than farming with our lives.
I see.
So I went to a little high school. There were 17 in my graduating class from high school.
Wow.
About a third of the people in my class went on to college. But I thought, as I entered my junior and senior year, that I would follow in my older brother's footsteps and probably go to Purdue University and become an engineer. But as I entered my senior year, I decided, that's not what I really wanted to do. My wife, Carol Ann, and I started dating when she was in the 7th grade and I was a sophomore in high school.
Wow.
And we've been going steady and have been married for 56 of those years.
Wow.
And I'm very proud of her because she wanted a college education as well, wanted to become a special ed teacher and all of that. So anyway, it sort of worked out that we stayed together and became married, or we were married when I was in a junior medical student. And so she's been through all the phases of surgical training and has been dedicated and loved and supported me for the 56 years of our marriage. So it's been great. So
that's extraordinary.
I didn't know anybody in medicine when my math teacher in high school suggested that I take an aptitude test.
Okay.
And I took that aptitude test. It combined my sort of desire to be a problem solver and to work with my hands with the faith that we grew up with, that, a purpose in life was to do something for others, not just ourselves.
Yes.
So that aptitude test was strongly favoring a career in medicine, and I'd never considered it before, that aptitude test. So I give a lot of credit to pointing me in that direction. So
wow.
1963, I went to Indiana University at Bloomington as a pre-med student. However, my high school didn't offer physics, chemistry, or a foreign language. So I had to start out with beginning courses at IU, and then it took me a semester to catch up with my pre-med class. So, and because I was borrowing money for room and board and tuition, I was able to finish undergrad and medical school in 7 years, which was allowed at that point in time, just so I wouldn't run up more educational debt than I had to. So.
And your girlfriend and then wife, did she also go to IU as well?
She went to IU as well. She was 2 years younger than I, so we only overlapped the 1 year at Indiana University in Bloomington.
I see.
And we chuckle about this now. She said, "You were so concerned about whether you'd be able to get into medical school or not. We didn't do a lot of socializing. We didn't have a lot of movies or dates or ball games to go to. We spent a lot of time both studying in the library and that sort of thing. But anyway,
wow.
It paid off in the long run."
So, John, you went to medical school, and when you were in med school, obviously at some point you decided you wanted to be a surgeon. How did that decision come about?
Well, it was fairly easy. I guess the courses that I liked the most in the first 2 years of medical school were anatomy and physiology. And where some of my, classmates sort of stood back during cadaver dissection and that sort of thing, I wanted to be all about it. And so I loved the anatomy and I loved the physiology, and the heart physiology was measurable, and cardiac surgery was in its infancy at that point in time, and I thought cardiac surgery sounds like it would be a great field to pursue. And then I had the opportunity after my second year of medical school to spend 3 months in a sort of an off quarter with two adult cardiac surgeons at a large private hospital in Indianapolis called Methodist Hospital. John Pittman and Harry Sedaris. They had one general surgery resident for the two of them. And so when I spent those 3 months, I was first assistant on most of their cardiac cases where the general surgery resident wasn't spending his day. And so they gave me enormous responsibility as a young medical student, not only in the operating room, but taking care of their patients post-operatively. And actually, they hired me to babysit the fresh pumps for the hours of about 6 p.m. to midnight on those cases that I'd scrubbed on. So
wow.
I got a lot of experience as a medical student, with cardiac surgery. Then I went back to my junior year. I loved all of my clinical rotations, medicine as well as surgery, but I gravitated to the surgeons because I was fascinated by what they were able to do and how they were able to change the courses of patients' lives with what they did in the operating room. And then what really sealed the deal was, as a congenital heart surgeon, I spent a month rotation with Dr. Harold King, who was chief of the cardiac service at Indiana University, and he was a congenital heart surgeon. And I was truly amazed in my rotation with him about what he was able to accomplish in the operating room with children with congenital heart disease, and decided at that time, if I could do anything with my career, I'd like to do what Harold King did. And so I sort of am living my dream in that respect.
So I guess then it would be fair to say you looked up to him a lot, I'm guessing, based on that time. And what kinds of operations, this is, I guess, must be in the late 1960s, or is this the early 70s?
Right, or late 1960s.
Right. So what kinds of surgeries were you observing? What kind of congenital heart surgeries were you watching at that time?
Well, I think the ones that made the biggest impression on me were complete AV septal defect, AV canals, and tetralogy. And Dr. King was a master surgeon. And in those days, we didn't have, pulmonary valve replacements. They all had, all the children with pulmonary stenosis got a big transangular patch and were left with pulmonary regurgitation. But his survival rate was in the high 90%. Even in those early days, and so he had excellent results. And the residents that I scrubbed, was on the rotation with, were very impressed. He says, there's nobody in the country that I think has better outcomes than he does with some of these more complicated procedures in those days.
I see.
We palliated many things, as you well know. Shunts and PA bandings and that sort of thing were commonplace. So.
I was wondering, it must have been quite an extraordinary change over the course of your career, starting your career in an era of palliation and ending your career in primary repairs. That must have been quite a lot of change. I guess it was exciting, but probably, I guess you never stopped learning the entire, 45 years you were practicing.
Exactly. It was a very exciting time, and I think I learned early on in my career to, I joined an organization called the Congenital Heart Surgeon Society. And so these were a lot of my peers from around the country and that sort of thing. And we had an annual meeting in Chicago and talked about the problems that we had encountered with some of these early, like arterial switches and Norwood procedures and things like that, and worked out a lot of details. And I consider that educational opportunity to be one of the most important of my early career.
So, John, I know that you did your congenital training in Michigan. How did you come to decide to go there? I mean, obviously, we all know that Michigan is one of the great congenital heart centers. How did you make that decision? There were a couple of great places at that time.
Sure. Well, one of my early mentors, John Pittman, the private cardiac surgeon, had trained at University of Michigan. And then Dr. Harold King, my chief at Indiana University, and Herb Sloan, who was the chief of cardiac surgery at Michigan, were close friends. And he said, you really ought to look at the University of Michigan for your for your general surgery and cardiac surgical training. And although I visited other places because I wasn't sure I could get into Michigan, Michigan was my first choice, and they accepted me. And so I spent from 1970 and finished up my cardiothoracic surgical training in 1978. And then I had 2 years in the midst of that to spend at the NIH with Glenn Morrow on the cardiac surgical service. And he gave us a lot of responsibility, not only in the operating room, but also taught us how to write manuscripts and papers for the surgical literature.
You know, it's always seemed to me that surgeons who trained in Michigan are uniformly pretty good. And the reason I say that is it's always seemed to me like maybe they allow the surgical trainees to do more there than in other places. What did you as a fellow, in the 1970s, what did they allow you to do? Were you like first operating on complex babies, and how did that work?
Well, no, we obviously did a lot of the palliative operations, and we were first assistants on the complicated congenital procedures. But, we only got to spend a few months on the congenital service, so we weren't allowed to do all that much. But as a general surgeon, we were given tremendous responsibility at the what we called the Wayne County General Hospital. We sort of ran the service, operated day and night, where the staff was in the room, but not necessarily scrubbed on the cases. So I would do complex abdominal operations and vascular operations with the help of a junior resident. And so we did get tremendous responsibility. And I think, that's, as I look at training now, it's not quite the same. We were not allowed to give our residents that much independence. A lot of what I learned about congenital heart surgery, I learned when I came back to Indiana at the staff, and what I learned at the NIH with Dr. Morrow, those 2 years I was in the service.
I'm interested to hear about how you think about the training. Like today, I know there are residencies where you can basically categorically choose to do cardiac surgery right from the start. And then there are the more traditional path, I guess, is where you do general surgery, followed by a fellowship in cardiac surgery. I'm wondering, it sounds to me like you found your general surgical experience very, very helpful. What do you think about the present move to sort of turn programs more into these sort of cardiac surgical residencies rather than the old, more traditional approach?
Well, initially I was skeptical because I thought everybody had to do their training the way I did, and that I loved the independence that I had as a general surgeon, sort of gained surgical maturity, and we learned how to work with others and junior people and that sort of thing. However, with the combined residency program that we have now, I'm quite impressed with the people who elect to do the integrated program, where they basically have a cardiothoracic surgery residency, spend a good amount of time in their first 2 or 3 years on general surgery, but the rest of their time they spend on cardiothoracic surgical services. And I have to admit, our early graduates seem to be quite competitive with what I considered the traditional training in the past. So I think it was an experiment, but I think it's probably going to work out. Now, once you finish a residency in congenital heart surgery, you're not a trained congenital heart surgeon, because you're not generally allowed to do a lot of complex neonates and that sort of thing as a cardiothoracic resident. You help. However, I've helped my residents. They do more than a 50% of an arterial switch and a good portion of the Norwoods and the AV canals and the tetralogies and the whole gamut of things. But they don't do it independently. We're always scrubbed and in the operating room and directing the operation whenever our residents are with us. So.
And was this always the case even when you were in training, or do you think that when you were a resident and a fellow in congenital heart surgery that you had more independence and were able to do more of the surgery, allowed to do more of the surgeries, or is it similar, do you think, today?
No, I think definitely residents this day and age are not allowed to do as much as I was allowed to do. I think during my residency at Michigan, and the program wasn't all that big in the 1960s. In the early 1970s, we probably did 200 total cases or 250 total cases a year. Of course, it's 3 or 4 times that now. Ed Bovine, who was the long-term chief there, was my junior resident, and he and I spent a lot of our residency, both in general and cardiac surgery, together, and have remained close friends ever since that time. But it's had a great reputation, and I think they train excellent surgeons in their residency program, as I think we do here at IU as well, because I think our residents get to do generally considerably more than residents in many other programs, at least the ones where I've talked with the residents.
I see. Well, getting back to your history, John, you finished up your training, and then how did you get a job back at Indiana University? I know you had trained there, but and also at Riley. I mean, when you started, were you doing both congenital and regular adult cardiac surgery? I know that in the past, surgeons very routinely would do that. And if so, did you at some point say, I'm not doing adult stuff anymore? Or how did that transition work? And how did you start your career there?
Well, I met with Dr. King, the chief of the cardiac service, and who was a congenital heart surgeon, as a senior medical student. And I said my dream would be to come back to Riley and to IU and practice congenital heart surgery.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether I can get the training that requires. When I was a medical student, I had no idea. It was a very competitive field. And so I just said, I'd like to, keep in communication. So fortunately, in 1977, a year after I finished my general surgery training, I took my general surgery boards in Indianapolis. And so I had one more year of cardiac surgical training, which I finished in June of 1978. So I went to his office in 77, and I said, I'd love to come back to Indiana University and to Riley. And he says, give me a week or two to do some checking around about, sort of how you're perceived by your Michigan people, and I'll get back with you. Well, within a couple of weeks, he said, you're hired. You've got a job at Indiana University. So, as I was starting my chief year as a cardiothoracic resident, I knew I was going to be able to go back to Indiana and to go back to Riley and, sort of live my dream. Wow. And so it's just worked out that very well in that regard.
Well, I'm guessing you did pretty well in Michigan then. Now, were you always only performing congenital heart surgery as an attending, or did you do a lot of adult stuff in the beginning of your career?
I did. The first 15 years of my career, I did probably about a 50-50 split. 50%. I was totally independent as an adult cardiac surgeon, but I did general thoracic and I did thoracic vascular work very independently with just junior help. And so I just gained an awful lot of experience. And then I would help Dr. King with complex cases, which, in those days were canals and TEPs and truncuses and things like that. But he really sort of shied away from newborn stuff. And I was fascinated by neonatal surgery. And so our volume in the late 1980s, sort of the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, sort of doubled or tripled. And so I got so busy doing congenital cardiac operations, I didn't have that much time to spend doing adults. Now, I've always done some adults. And, I've done a lot of adult congenital stuff and continue to do that. I help my partners with complex congenital and adult congenital cardiac cases to this day.
I see.
But anyway, starting out, I did an awful lot of, the standard stuff: coronary bypass surgery, valve replacements, thoracic aortic work, abdominal aortic work, lung cancer, esophageal cancer, the whole thing. So I kept very busy. But I also knew that starting a research laboratory, that was one of my demands when I came back to Indiana. I said I must have a research laboratory because I had several problems that I wanted to work out in an animal laboratory and apply those to the field of congenital heart surgery.
Wow. Well, I want to definitely get to that, but I was wondering, John, you started your career really before the main era of neonatal heart surgery. You essentially, I guess, had to learn it on the fly during your actual professional career. How did you actually do that? Like, how did you learn? These are not easy operations. To learn how to do an arterial switch or a Norwood, you don't just wake up one day and say, I read a book on this, I think I'm ready. How did you learn how to do this and actually start doing them?
Well, I was fortunate enough to have a good mentor in Harold King. However, he'd not done any of these complex neonatal operations as well. So we worked out a lot of our techniques together, and then he allowed me to go back and visit my co-resident Ed Beauvais in the early days of switch surgery. I went to Vanderbilt and watched, since we started out doing mustard operations for transposition of the great arteries, Dr. King wanted me to find out, is a stenting a better operation than a mustard? And after spending a couple of days at Vanderbilt, I decided they're very similar operations. I think what we really ought to do is go to the arterial switch thing, which started in the mid-1980s. And I think we started doing switches in 1986.
I see.
And never looked back.
Wow.
But obviously the mortality was a little higher during our learning curve.
Yeah.
But because I was able to visit a few other institutions, and then with the help of my colleagues in the Congenital Heart Surgeons Society, I could call them up and I said, I had this issue with this particular place. What's been your experience? And they would do the same with me. And then we would meet once a year and sort of air our difficulties and our successes with each other, and we learned from each other along the way. So that's how it was done. But there was a lot of self-teaching during those years.
I'm wondering, you've seen and done it all. What do you think about public reporting today and how it has affected training versus, say, when you were, I assume most of the time you were in training, there was not public reporting.
Not at all.
And so, and now, of course, everybody is very worried about their STS numbers being publicly reported, as well as things like U.S. News and World Report. Do you think that this has had it seems to me like it's had a negative impact on surgical training, but I wonder, as someone who really is right in the thick of it, what your thoughts are on this?
I think it has. We just can't give our residents the independence that we had early on in our careers during our training and all. So I think it has had a deleterious effect. However, I guess I do most of my surgery on the left side of the operating table, and my resident or junior staff is almost always on the right side of the table. And that's sort of the way it was at Michigan. So, I feel very confident in the abilities of the residents that are going through our program to be able to, to cut and sew and do some of the very complicated aspects of the operation, as long as I'm there to guide every movement. And so I think our outcomes reflect the fact that the outcomes are not affected by letting residents do a good portion of most of the operations that we do.
But I do think there's probably a great skill to being able to be on the left side of the table and conduct such a complicated operation with someone who isn't, very experienced in that. You're making it sound like it's very straightforward, but I'm sure it's very nerve-wracking as the quote-unquote assistant when you're really sort of directing the operation.
Well, you can direct from the left-hand side of the table as well as you can from the right-hand side of the table. And you really want your trainees or your residents to be able to see it as they are likely to see it if they decide to become congenital heart surgeons. And so I've trained 100 cardiothoracic residents in my career. And, there's probably a dozen of them that are congenital heart surgeons. And I'm proud of every one of them. And I'm proud to have had at least contributed a bit to their training and how to do it, and they got to see it from the surgeon's perspective during their training.
I see. Well, John, you're known for so many different things. I'm going to only touch on two of them. The first I wanted to talk about was the bovine jugular vein. I know that you pretty much were the person who came up with this idea. I did not know that until I started reading about you. Tell me how you even had this idea to potentially use a cow vein in a child. How did you study this? Was there a lot of resistance when you first started thinking about this? I'm fascinated to know the story of that.
Well, it goes back to my residency, in the mid 1970s, late 1970s. We'd been replacing the pulmonary valve with xenografts, usually a porcine aortic valve and a Dacron tube. And we were taking a good number of those out of small children, and they just were not durable. And so I was very interested in problem solving. That started at the NIH with the apical aortic conduit to treat tunnel subaortic stenosis, and Dr. Morrow said, fix this problem. And so I worked long and hard on that project. But like that, when I was finishing my residency, I decided we needed to come up with something better than a xenograft inside a Dacron tube.
Right.
And felt that maybe the Dacron was the big problem and not necessarily the xenograft. So
is that like a Hancock? You're talking about like a Hancock.
It's the old Hancock conduit.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
Hancock conduit. So one of the first things that I did when I came back to IU, and Dr. King, my boss, allowed me to have an animal research laboratory that the department paid for.
Yeah.
The trouble of it, there was no chronic animal care facility for large animals at IU. So that was a problem, because in order to study RVPA conduits and pulmonary valves, you had to follow these animals over a number of months to years.
Sure.
And to solve that problem, my wife Carol Ann and I bought a large home about 20 miles south of Indianapolis that had a big dog kennel on it. And so I gave my lab technician, Randy Bills, free rent if he would transport the animals from the kennel to my animal laboratory. We'd operate on them, and then he would take them back and care for them in the kennel until they needed a next heart cath, or till they needed to be brought back up where we looked at the conduits that we'd explanted or that we'd put in months or years before. Wow. And it was during that period of time that we were able to do that. Now, we were the ones that bought the farm and supported it, but Dr. King took care of my other research needs. Now, the trouble of it is that I was shown the bovine jugular vein at a surgical meeting in 1988.
Okay.
And a company called Venpro was using bovine jugular veins to treat varicose veins in adults in Europe. And I met this biomedical engineer at a previous meeting, and he showed this to me in a little jar of glutaraldehyde. He says, do you think you could use this in congenital heart surgery? Well, he allowed me to look at it and examine it, and it had all of the features that I thought would be an ideal RVPA conduit for a baby or a child. And so he gave me the first two that he had. He gave me the only two that he had at that period of time, and he'd gotten those from a slaughterhouse somewhere, and had treated valves with glutaraldehyde. Well, he couldn't provide more for me, so I decided we could solve that problem. So there was a slaughterhouse just south of Indianapolis, and I went and talked with the owner and told him what I wanted to do, and I wanted to study this problem in children. And he allowed my lab technician, Randy Bills, and my resident who was in my laboratory at the time, Vince Scavo, to come down once a week or once every other week and harvest the jugular vein from cows that he was slaughtering for meat. And so we got very proficient. And so in an hour in the morning, so we couldn't slow down their process, we would harvest both jugular veins from a cow's neck and, obtain, there's 3 valves in each side of that vein. So we had 6 conduits in one trip to the slaughterhouse. And we glutaraldehyde preserved them and then put them in animals. And we did that over a number of years.
I didn't understand that the jugular vein in a cow has 3 valves in it, actually?
3 valves. It's alternating between tricuspid and bicuspid valves. And on one side, it may be different than the other.
Wow.
But we decided that the tri-leaflet valves were probably going to be most acceptable to the FDA. Well, Venpro also was showing this valve to congenital heart surgeons in Europe. And so, but Venpro used all of the data that we obtained in my research laboratory at Indiana to satisfy Europeans for the CE mark. And so they got a CE mark in Europe to use it in children about a year before we were able to use it in the United States.
Using your data.
Using our data. using our data. So they got the CE mark. However, I had a child with truncus arteriosus that I'd operated on as a newborn, and his pulmonary homograph became very regurgitant in about 6 months.
Yeah.
So I contacted the FDA and I said, this valve has CE mark in Europe. I've done all the animal research for it. Can I use one of their valves in a child at Riley Hospital? And lo and behold, I did, and that child did very well. And the valve lasted him for a decade or more. And then that started a long series of bovine jugular vein conduits for the right heart reconstruction.
John, why does a bovine jugular vein graft have better longevity than a homograft? I wasn't aware that was the case.
Well, I think there's an immune response to any homograft. I've thought that from the very beginning, and our laboratory studies and our histology studies sort of indicate that. Now, I think that decellularized pulmonary homografts that we're using today, the ones that are furnished by a company called CryoLife, are more durable than the ones that were not decellularized. So that's why I thought. The nice thing about a jugular vein, it's used to venous pressure. The leaflets are delicate, they open easily, they close nicely, and all of that. And so, like a homograft, which is used to venous pressure for the most part, they should be the same. But the bovine jugular vein outperformed pulmonary homografts, in my experience, until the day that they became decellularized, which was about 2008, 2009. So
now
we use them both. In small children, we use bovine jugular veins today for most of the complex repair. But when I'm doing a Ross procedure, which we do quite commonly in Indiana, we use pulmonary homografts that are decellularized. So I haven't given up totally on pulmonary homografts, but we use the Contegra for most of the babies.
Now, I'm wondering, I'm sure you were aware that Philip Bonhoeffer was taking your valve and putting it in a stent and creating the Melody valve. Did you have anything at all to do with that? Did he contact you or speak with you about it as he was developing that?
I spoke with him, I think, on one occasion, and I sort of communicated through the company about my experience and that sort of thing. And so I tried to get Medtronic to do a comparative study with a percutaneously placed bovine jugular vein with a surgical implant, but nobody would ever do it.
Right.
I sort of thought that maybe the surgical implant valves would last a little bit longer because of some of the early stent issues. But I think they're probably quite comparable today.
I actually think the opposite, John. I think that when they're put in on a stent, they last longer because the stent usually protects it. Now, initially, you're probably aware that we didn't realize you had to put a lot of protective metal, bare metal stents around it. But now that we sort of routinely put 1 or 2 or even 3 bare metal stents before placing the Melody, it seems to have pretty good longevity. Although, as I'm sure you're also aware, people are slowly moving away from it and moving more towards the Edwards valve and Sapien valves, but still a very popular valve used all the time, and a lot of really great aspects to it. Now, the other aspect of your career, which we haven't even talked about, just shows you how Dr. Brown has just been, a polymath and is just involved in so many different things. You were the first person to perform a pediatric heart transplant in Indiana. Now, how did you get involved in that? And were you the lead transplant surgeon for a long time there?
Well, I did start the program. Yes, I was the lead surgeon for both adults and children. But I had help. I had some great pediatric cardiologists, Randy Caldwell and Bob Dara, and then Jackie O'Donnell on the adult side, and then we hired Mark Turrentine as our first transplant fellow. And before he'd even started a cardiothoracic residency, he finished general surgery, and he came to us as a transplant fellow and fell in love with congenital heart surgery as well as transplantation. And he was technically excellent. And so as soon as he finished his residence, we hired him, and he very quickly became the leader of our pediatric heart transplant program. And he and I probably did, 150 to 250 adult and pediatric heart transplants together.
I see.
So anyway, we've had a great team to start. We were fortunate enough early in the career, and I think it still holds, that we did the one and only twin-to-twin heart transplant that's ever been done in the world. Turned out the little boy of the twins had hypoplastic left heart syndrome, and the little girl had the little boy was born with a nuchal cord and was brain dead, and the little girl had hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Wow. So we took brother's heart and put it in the little girl. She's now 34 years old and has not had a documented significant rejection episode in the 34 years she's been alive.
Wow.
She's still on suppression. We've been afraid to stop it, but she's done extraordinarily well.
Wow.
So, but anyway, we, in mid 80s, our results with the Norwood procedure left quite a bit to be desired. So we offered heart transplantation to babies born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome.
Right.
And the family participate in the decision making. And then later even did the study comparing the outcomes of the two approaches. So anyway, we got started early on in the mid-1980s and have continued today and still have a strong congenital heart transplant program.
Well, for those in the audience, it's late on Monday evening. Dr. Brown has really been so kind to speak with us about his extraordinary career, but I think I would be remiss without asking you to speak a little bit about your family. I mean, we've already heard that your poor wife, Carol Ann, allowed you to buy a farm with a kennel to conduct your research. If that's not love, I don't know what it is. But I'm wondering, you were married. You're married over 50 years. I know that you have 3 kids and multiple grandchildren. How were you able to have such an extraordinarily productive professional career and still have a very meaningful personal life and a family life?
Well, I have to give most credit to Carol Ann. She knew that I was passionate about what I was doing, and she knew the importance of what I was doing. And so she was just able to shoulder a lot of the responsibility when our kids were young and that sort of thing. She was just there. She interrupted her teaching career so that she could raise our children when they were young. And then as they got to be teenagers, I tried to, I had them make rounds with me at the hospital, and I took each one of them on a heart transplant harvest and implantation and that sort of thing. So they had a little bit of inkling about what's going on. But, Carol Ann made it all possible for me to pursue this kind of a life that I've loved to do. It's been grueling. We talk about work-life balance. That term wasn't even invented during my career.
Yes.
That's a term that
it's a 2024 term.
Didn't exist in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the early 2000s. So, the training was grueling. The responsibility that you had for your patients, it was one of those situations where, you couldn't promise a family the outcome that you both wanted for their child. But I guess I would promise each family that I would treat their child as if the child were my own.
Yeah.
And, that served me very well but it required a lot of phone calls at night, a lot of interrupted meals, and things like that. But I guess if I had to say Carol Ann deserves a major amount of credit, but our kids were understanding. They all turned out to be great kids. I think they understood what I was doing and appreciated what I was doing. And then family vacations were one of those things where we all got together, for a couple of weeks in the summertime when they were off. And then Carol Ann and I always attended a ski meeting with other congenital cardiologists and cardiac surgeons, which gave us sort of a yearly honeymoon. So we could have, a week to spend with each other and without kids. And both of our sets of parents made that possible to look after our kids while we were gone. So there are many, many facets of people that have.
And John, did any of your kids or your grandchildren go into medicine or any area related to medicine?
Well, only peripheral related. My oldest son, Jason, works for Eli Lilly and Company.
Okay.
And so he's related there. But, he used to come to the operating room and videotape complex congenital operations. So all of that, we had a great time together and still do. My daughter runs a AI company that deals with hospitals and pharmaceutical companies looking at customer feedback. And so she has a startup company, and so she's all into medical stuff as well. And then my youngest son, Peter, is a physical therapist out in Colorado, and he's married to a nurse practitioner. So there's a lot of medicine in our family.
No question.
Wow. But none of them wanted to be heart surgeons. Carol Ann said they were paying attention. They didn't want the lifestyle that you have had all these years.
Right. Well, you've achieved so much, been honored by so many times in your career. I'm wondering, is there one thing that you're most proud of in your professional and personal life as you think back on the entirety of your massive career? I mean, really, you have two extraordinary achievements: a surgeon for over 45 years and married for. Did you say 55 years or 56?
56 years. 56, coming up on our 56th anniversary.
Wow. So those are two pretty amazing accomplishments. I'm wondering, what do you view as your biggest accomplishments when you look back upon your very extraordinary life?
Well, again, I have to give credit to Carol Ann, who's sort of supported me and made a home for me and our kids and that sort of thing along the way. And I've had some great mentors along the way and colleagues. I've had pediatric cardiologists that were just superb and partners. Mark Turrentine, Mark Rodefeld, Jeremy Herman, wonderful people who sort of bought into the same philosophy that I had about patient care, particularly as it applies to children. And so we've had a great team, and we've worked very hard, and we've I think accomplished a fair amount during that 46 years or so that I've been doing it.
So John, I'm going to finish up now. I know you're still working a little bit, but you're like I guess you're like sort of semi-retired. What do you do? What do you do in your free time? I mean, you've spent the last half century operating continuously. What is a surgeon of your magnitude? What do you do when you have some free time now?
I'm busier now than I think that I have ever been. Carol Ann and I have about a 600-acre farm in southern Indiana that we manage. We don't do any of the farm work, although I love to get on a tractor and do bush hogging and things like that for weed control. I love to hunt. I love to fish. And I love to spend time with my grandkids. They're all in various sports and musical sort of things. And so Carol Ann and I, 3 or 4 times a week, are in one performance or in sporting event or another. So we spend an awful lot of time with our grandkids. And my mother, who's 102, is still alive, is still very sharp. And so we try to get down there weekly to see her. All my siblings are still alive, and my 2 older brothers are in their mid-80s and that sort of thing, and all very active people. So I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Wow.
And I'm proud of, I guess, my parents who taught us how to work hard. I'm proud of Carol Ann. I'm proud of our kids. And I'm proud of sort of the legacy of patient care that we've left behind. It's not what you do, it's what you leave behind that sort of counts. And I'm very proud of the kind of program that we have at Indiana University and what we do for kids.
Well, that's a wonderful summary. Well, Dr. Brown, I just can't thank you enough. What an inspiring story. I think I don't know what I want to do now. I think I have to go to the gym and work out or something. I've been so inspired by the story of your life. Thank you so very much for all that you've done in your career, of course, but most importantly tonight, thank you for spending a little bit of time with us in what sounds like a very busy, semi-retired life to speak about your life. And I'm sure everybody listening to the podcast is going to be very excited to hear from you and hear about you.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure that, like me, you're inspired by Dr. Brown's story. He made so many interesting points and certainly has lived a wonderful life, helping so many. And I don't mean just patients, but also family and colleagues. I think his dedication to training the next generation has been unparalleled. And if I were to take just one quote of his many from this wonderful conversation, it would be when he stated that, quote, "It's not what you do, it's what you have left behind that counts." I think we can all use that in thinking about our own lives and what each of us can leave behind to make this place a better one. I'm most appreciative to Dr. Brown for taking time out of a very busy semi-retirement to speak with us this week on Pediheart. To conclude this 309th episode of Pediheart Pediatric Cardiology Today, honoring Dr. John Brown, we hear the wonderful Italian baritone Ettore Bastianini singing the lovely 1911 Neapolitan love song Cor Ingrato by Cardillo, and this song was actually written in the United States, though is perhaps the only such Neapolitan love song not penned in Italy. Bastianini was known as one of the greatest baritones of his day, singing throughout the world, and he sadly and tragically died in 1967 at the young age of only 45 after battling throat cancer for a number of years. Thank you very much for joining me for this 309th episode, and once again I'd like to thank Dr. Brown for spending time with us and sharing his life with us. I hope all have a good week ahead.
Queste parole amare perché me parli o cuore me dormiente Catari e non te scurdo cata giodate o cuore Catari non te scurdo Catari che venne a dicere sto parla che me la spase me tu e non c'è pienza sto dolore mio o non c'è pienza no tu non te ne cura te pigliò non c'è